Hi everyone, thank you for joining. We'll just wait a second to see if there's anyone else who is joining. And do let us know if you kind of either can't hear us or see us or have any kind of technical difficulties in the next couple of minutes. We are we're having our own gremlins, so I won't be altogether that surprised if you have some too. So do let us know if there's anything. We will kind of keep letting people in the meantime for the next couple of minutes. Oh good, we have a thumbs up, so I'm guessing that means it must work. But perfect. So thank you so much for joining us. Happy Tuesday, I suppose. And thank you so much for joining us on today's session. I'm really excited to do this one alongside Carla. It's been quite a long time in the kind of offing, and we've had quite a lot of conversations about what we wanted to talk about and what we think is really important today. So yeah, so thank you so much for coming. This is our first of 3 sessions. So this first one is about what employers need to know about kind of the crossover between money and kind of money concerns and where that starts to impact on people's mental health and kind of how employers can kind of navigate that support. So a little bit of an introduction. I'm obviously Alicia Collinson. I'm from Thrive Law. I'm a senior associate here at Thrive.
Thanks, Alicia. And for those who don't know me, I'm Carla Hoppe. I'm the founder and CEO of Wealthbrite. I'm really happy to be here joining Thrive Law today to talk about this really important conversation on the link between money and mental health. For those that don't know about Wealthbrite, we support employers to build up financial literacy and support financial well-being within their employees.
Yeah, so it's really just to give you an idea of kind of why we wanted to put this together. We've kind of been collaborating and working in quite a lot of different ways in terms of studies, and Carla's actually come and talked to our team about our own financial well-being, and it was really, really insightful. And we thought that we wanted to try and have a bit of a wider conversation and bring that to life for kind of a wider organisation, a wider audience, talking about not only kind of the well-being and legal obligations, which are really well established, but thinking about financial well-being and thinking about how interlinked they are and what that support does look like. So that's kind of what the point is today. So hopefully that's what you're expecting us to talk about. And that would be great. But yeah, okay. So what does our plans for today look like? So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about what we mean by mental health and kind of the importance of language around there. Then I'm going to talk about kind of when it might amount to a disability and then what warrants reasonable adjustments. And then Carla's going to talk about some really amazing kind of data that Wealthbrite's picked up on the link between money and the impact on mental health, because what we're going to try and get across to you guys is that it's not a binary kind of one route. They're kind of interlinked, and one causes the other. They can both be the cause and effect of poor mental health, and then poor financial well-being can also cause poor mental health. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about a little bit, and then we're going to do a little bit of a kind of discussion about what as employers we can be doing to really kind of tackle or address some issues proactively and be kind of forward thinking on recognizing that link and putting kind of support systems in there for that particular thing. So we've got a poll that is meant to be a little bit flashier than it is, but the system isn't working. So Carla's going to share it actually in the chat for you, which should link to a Slido poll that might open in a separate window for you. Is that right?
Yes, it will. And if you just bear with me, everyone, it's actually going to go into the Q&A. So hopefully you can see it in the Q&A. Just the chat function, I think, is not for everyone. So everyone can access the Q&A. Hopefully, give me a thumbs up if you can see it in there. And hopefully you'll be able to click on the link and it will ask you a simple question. I can see some people are already answering, so it's obviously working. That's nice. Great. So we're really just asking people to answer the question, how confident do you feel right now understanding the link between money and mental health? And really just to get a gauge, no right or wrong answers here, just to get a gauge on how informed you feel you are on this topic, and whether you feel there's burning questions you might have. We'd love to hear them as we go further through the session. But this will just give us a sense of the levels of information that you already have and how we can improve on them. So I can see a few answers. That's great. Thank you so much. I think, Alicia, over to you.
Yeah, so thanks so much. The other reason why I find these polls really helpful is that if you're kind of hoping we're going to touch on something specific that, or you feel like you can't give that topic a 4 or 5 yet because there's something you just don't know, and then we don't talk about it by the end, there's going to be time for questions in the Q&A then. So it really is the opportunity, if when we're going to ask this poll again at the end in the hope that you'll all go up in the numbers, and if for whatever reason you haven't been able to, that's a really good opportunity for your reflection to ask the question that would mean that you do feel like you're more empowered to go up on that number. So hopefully that will all kind of link in a little bit for you. But that's so helpful. Thank you. So I'm going to start a little bit more holistically talking about what we mean by mental health, because I think it's so important when we talk about mental health to just get the language right and make sure that when we're addressing it, we kind of know what it is that we are talking about. So some of this might be a little bit rudimentary, but I still think it's important to kind of start from that baseline. So we all have mental health just in the same way we have physical health. So we can all have mentally healthy days in the same way we can all have physically healthy days, but sometimes we have a cold or a sore throat, and sometimes we're just a little bit run down emotionally and psychologically. So your mental health is effectively anything to do with someone's emotional, psychological, and social well-being, and it can be good and it can be bad. It's a spectrum. Now, what is then kind of the nudge into poor mental health is when we're kind of consistently not experiencing positive mental well-being. And then there is almost the next point where mental ill health is when that poor mental health impacts someone to the point where it becomes a diagnosable mental health condition. So poor mental health in of itself, we may just be having a bad week or so, but that does not warrant a diagnosis or necessarily any intervention further than just good self-care, in the same way that if we had a cold, we might just need to have a few days to lie down. Where we're then adjusting that is where we start to think about people who are diagnosed with mental health conditions that might warrant intervention, might warrant further support, and certainly from an employer perspective, warrant further consideration in how to support those people. And mental health conditions are vast and wide ranging, and there's so many different types, but the most common ones are things like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, but also forms of things like eating disorders, which people do sometimes overlook from an employer perspective. Now, in today's session, when Carla and I were talking about this, one of the two that we mainly discussed actually was the link between anxiety and depression and mental health, and that's something that we're going to talk about quite a lot here today, but it is just worth bearing in mind. Obviously, there's a huge range of different experiences when we talk about mental health conditions. So what we then need to kind of think about is when does that poor mental health amount to a disability under the Equality Act? Now, a disability under the Equality Act is defined as a physical or mental impairment which has a substantial and long-term adverse effect on the ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. It's quite a long-winded definition, but I mean, of course it is. So there's a couple of pieces to kind of unpick here, which is, first of all, what we're looking for in the case of mental ill health is not a diagnosed condition. It is just an identified impairment that has that impact. So something from an employer's perspective we can sometimes see is that employers can say, well, I don't know I don't like to use this language kind of casually, but I don't know what's wrong with them, so I don't have to support it. They're not in therapy, they've not given me evidence of their medical documents, so I don't need to intervene in any way. Actually, that's not the case. If we can demonstrate that there is clearly some form of impairment that is having that substantial and long-term adverse effect, that's all that we, from an employer's responsibility perspective, that's kind of what the tail end of that responsibility is. That's the important piece that we need to understand. As long as that impact is long-term, which would mean it's either lifelong or likely to or has lasted more than 12 months, and substantial. And substantial is frustratingly defined because it's defined by case law as more than minimal. But effectively what we're asking for there is that we can demonstrate that it has an impact on someone's day-to-day activities. And when we think about day-to-day activities, what we're not thinking about is just their ability to work. But much, much wider than that, things like their ability to sleep, their ability to travel, their ability to socialize, their ability to eat, and also things like their ability to manage their finances, or their ability to understand or kind of coherently explain their financial standpoint and things like that. So there's quite a lot of, as I say, this is kind of where you start to see that it can be a financial well-being both goes into part of the diagnosis and part of the definition and part of the consideration of might it be a disability, but then also could result from a disability as part of the effects of that condition that someone may have. So it is very interesting. One other point where we see this circle coming in is when we think about normal day-to-day activities. It was expanded in 2023 to also include the ability of that person to participate in an equal standing with non-disabled employees. Now, from an employment law perspective, that's quite strange because you get into a full circle where we have to put reasonable adjustments in so that people can participate equally. But if they can't participate equally, it's part of the definition of disability, and it's a little bit of a loop, but it's just something to be aware of because it does mean that there is that consideration of the ability to participate at work alongside just your quote unquote normal day-to-day activities. So we then need to think about whether or not we know about a disability, because something that comes up quite a lot from an employer perspective is, well, they didn't ever tell me, or more importantly, they didn't disclose it when they started their job. So there is no obligation for someone to tell an employer what their condition is, or if they have a mental health condition. There's certainly no obligation to disclose any form of medical diagnosis. However, if we're, as an employee, asking for that support, it would be reasonable for us to articulate what it is that we struggle with so that reasonable adjustments can be provided. And that is something that an employer can ask. So an employer can ask if there are any conditions that might require a reasonable adjustment that we can be mindful of. Now, other than that, the question for an employer is whether or not we knew of that condition or knew of the impairment or should have known. And the should have known is really important from an employer's perspective, because that's where I always say it demonstrates that ignorance is not a defence. So what an employer cannot do, because of this question of whether or not they should have known, what an employer cannot do is say, oh, you know, Sally started acting very strange and she seemed really upset and she kept crying at work, but I didn't want to ask her any questions because if I asked her questions, then I have to start intervening and taking care of her and putting initiatives in place. From behaviour, if we should have known that there may be something that requires further inquiries or further support, that is enough. And so ignorance from an employer's perspective is not sufficient to kind of ignore our duties there. And as I say, the question isn't whether or not we know what the condition is. So we certainly can't make things conditional on, you go off and tell me when you've been diagnosed with something and then I'll figure out how we support you after that. It has to be identifying what the impact is and how that impact is intervening at work. And what we sometimes say when we talk about reasonable adjustments is it's about identifying both how work affects the condition, but also how the condition affects work, and kind of that duality of the two, and what we can adjust to kind of lessen that impact from a work perspective. So what does it mean? So if we're talking about someone being disabled, that means that they have one of the 9 protected characteristics, which means that they are therefore protected against discrimination because of those protected characteristics. And that obviously includes your straightforward discrimination, which is your direct discrimination, where someone might be put under less favourable treatment because of a condition or a disability that they have. Now, one nuance when we think about disability discrimination, and something that we will talk about how this links with financial well-being, is that people who have a disability have an extra protection from unfavourable treatment arising from something associated with their condition. So a behaviour or an absence or something that they may have done wrong, if that can be linked to their disability, they are protected from unfavourable treatment because of that is not proportionate and does not have a legitimate aim. So when we start to think about the behaviours that people may display to do with financials or to do with financial concerns, if they're linked to a disability or a condition or an impairment that we know about, it's really important that an employer is really mindful of that link and make sure that we're therefore really being mindful of acting in a proportionate way against or in conclusion. And ideally, I suppose, thinking support first, as opposed to thinking sanction first, which you may want to do with a non-disabled employee. So something else that means is that if an employee has a disability, we need to think about reasonable adjustments. Now, reasonable adjustments are very simply interventions that an employer should put into place which levels the playing field between a disabled and a non-disabled employee. It can be really difficult to understand what's genuinely going to help, and I think that's always one of the key points when we think about reasonable adjustments, is that it's a two-way conversation between the employee and the employer to understand what is the impairment, what is the impact, and what can we provide that will lessen that, and really avoiding assumptions in those conversations. So even if we, for example, put other reasonable adjustments in place for someone who has anxiety and it worked really well for that employee, it's actually very unhelpful to suggest that we just replicate those same adjustments for someone else who has anxiety. So making sure that we treat everyone in those conversations as an individual, because that will make sure that those adjustments genuinely help. But adjustments only need to be granted if they are genuinely reasonable. And so things to do with whether or not it's kind of reasonable or not doesn't just take into consideration the financials, but also how the job can be done. If we're suggesting that a job is fundamentally different from the job that you were previously instructed to do, that wouldn't necessarily be a reasonable adjustment. Or something that kind of compromises the function of the business itself could also not be a reasonable adjustment. So there is this key point about adjustments are not just making everything how the individual wishes it would be, but bearing in mind what those constraints and those reasonable kind of factors are for an employer to bear in mind.
Absolutely. Amazing. Thanks, Lisa. There's a lot of information there, and I think it's I think my reflection as we've talked in preparation for this session is that this is quite a difficult topic for employers to navigate, and actually you have to really think quite deliberately about the different aspects that can go to make up somebody's poor mental health, and what could be influencing factors, what kind of signs you might be spotting, and therefore what can you realistically and reasonably do as employers. So I guess to help you a little bit with that, I'm going to just step us through a few things to think about, and some data points that will hopefully bring to life for you this link between money and mental health. And I think the first thing I wanted to say is that I think it's really important, if you take nothing else from this session, take the fact that it's kind of a two-way street, right? So on the one hand, we know, and there's a lot of data to support this, that worrying about money can affect your mental health. But equally, mental health status or your mental health condition can affect how you are managing your finances. And I think something I've sort of been learning as I've been talking to the Thrive team here is that I think it's not a necessarily easy job for an employer, but one they really need to be mindful of, is being able to watch the kind of spectrum of behavior that can show up as a result of financial stress or problematic financial behaviors that can show up in their workforce, and start to be able to think about, what is this information or this data telling me, and does it amount to that kind of threshold of knowing or should knowing that there's something more going on here when it comes to somebody's mental health. But to sort of put some numbers on this to kind of bring it to life, I think the first thing for you all to know is that in the UK, at least, and it is still the case, that financial worries are still the number one or most significant driver of poor mental health in working adults in the UK. Now, what poor mental health means varies, and at Wealthbrite we do a lot of analysis of this. We ask employees a lot of the time, how often are you worrying about money? the vast majority of people say they worry about money on a regular basis. And actually, we do see that those at the start of their careers have a much higher level of sort of financial anxiety or stress in the system. And one of the things we do is when we're measuring how do money worries show up, we ask people to report symptoms that they're feeling. And actually this year, I mean, we've just released an industry insights report looking at the state of financial well-being in the legal sector. And in this year's report, the symptoms that showed up most frequently were stress, a lack of motivation, sleepless nights, and depression. So I suppose on the one hand, if I'm putting myself in an employer's shoes, I guess it doesn't take a genius to know that if you're dealing with some of those symptoms, you're most certainly not going to be showing up and being your most effective of performing the best at work. But that doesn't necessarily amount to sort of the spectrum of, you know, showing up and underperforming at work might be one sign. But actually, I think the more damaging kind of symptoms that I wanted to flag here is the fact that actually we are seeing people tell us, I'm struggling with stress and I'm struggling with depression. And those can rise to the level of like recognized medical mental health conditions, which may, depending on the facts and circumstances, as Thrive have been saying, amount to something that qualifies as poor mental health that may give them additional protections from an employer perspective. And I think, you know, again, I want to emphasize that it's actually a much more pervasive issue than a lot of people, I think, realize. You know, there are a lot of people who are struggling and reporting these signs of poor mental health. You can see on the screen here, we find this year that 72% of workers that we spoke to as part of that industry exercise reported at least one sign of poor mental health in relation to their finances, which could be affecting their ability to function at work. So I think I know that a lot of employers are doing a lot of good work around creating safe, psychologically safe spaces for people to talk about mental health. I see a lot of good practices around role modeling in the workplace and mental health support. I think sometimes this link between money and mental health is not as, I guess, maybe not as frequently highlighted as perhaps it actually is within the individual, and these data points I think kind of makes that clear. And if you do want to just flick on to the next one, I think the other side of the equation. So I think if I think about general population in the workforce, I think it's important for you to know that a lot of people right now are reporting high levels of financial stress, and actually in some cases sort of depression and stress and anxiety are pretty rife in the system. On the flip side, if you're somebody that already has a pre-existing mental health condition, the data is equally strong that actually you are much more likely to be struggling with your finances. So you'll see on the screen here, this is a data point from the charity Mind that have shown in work they've done that you're twice as likely to be in problem debt if you have a pre-existing mental health condition. And again, I think it's important for employers to be thinking about the spectrum of issues that their people may be dealing with. I was revisiting some of the data this morning and saw that, you know, actually different people struggling with different kind of variants of mental health issues may be experiencing different types of financial problems. So there are studies looking at people with who are neurodivergent who actually have been shown to be struggling with keeping up with rent and bills. They may be relying on payday loans or living in their overdrafts and dealing with problematic debt situations. Equally, there are also some really compelling stories and data out there around people who may be struggling with addiction. And again, obviously you have to step through the legal requirements to determine whether an addiction is actually rises to the level of a disability. But actually gambling addictions can often put people in serious financial circumstances. And actually, if it's impacting their ability to show up and perform on the job day to day. There are a number of cases where it's been found, yes, that has risen to the level of a disability, and they do need additional support and reasonable adjustments to be able to manage and deal with their circumstances. So I think, again, the point I want to make here is that I think as employers, if you're looking at how can we be supporting our people when it comes to mental health, I want to really highlight and emphasize that the financial drivers that may lie behind some of these mental health situations that you're finding in the workforce are significant. And it's important to be thinking holistically. So when you are thinking about the types of support that you might be offering, that you're also considering what are we doing to provide support when it comes to financial education, financial well-being, and potentially even sort of crisis management financial support. And we'll come on to some of that in a moment. But hopefully that's given you a sense of like the scale of the issue and what we can be doing.
Yeah, thanks so much. I find that that statistic on the slide before about that, it is that circle, isn't it, that we keep coming back to. It can be both the cause and the kind of result, and how do we balance that? When we think about what we're looking for generally from an employee who may be struggling, there's things to bear in mind in terms of kind of your spot the signs. You will get a copy of these slides afterwards, so you will have these, but we just wanted to touch on a few of them because they're kind of key. Is a kind of a rise in absences and a rise in sick days, and pieces surrounding kind of a change in their productivity. Now, it's really interesting because what we have seen is things like requesting overtime, or asking for money when they wouldn't have done that before, or asking for kind of prepaid wages and things like that. That is another change of behaviour that should potentially just be a little bit of a flag of what's the underlying cause of this, because it is out of character. And I think that's something that's key, is when we talk about behavioural changes. So someone may appear to be withdrawn or maybe kind of anxious and irritable, but it is also the reverse can be true. So people who are suffering particularly badly with, let's say, anxiety might actually previously be quite a quiet person, go into what we would kind of refer to as like quite overdrive, and actually really overexpose themselves or be really vocal when they aren't normally, because they feel that level of anxiety, that they feel like they have to prove themselves or articulate themselves differently. So trying to just bear in mind that almost anything that is a little bit of a change in that behavior is just something that we should be mindful of, what is the underlying cause, and what is that underlying kind of link. But so yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to jump in. I just wanted to add to that. I think this is something that's quite important, because I think if you go back to the previous slide, and it shows the list of things, of ways in which sort of financial angst can show up for people, I want to make this connection because it's not always clear to people. And you'll hear me talking about this data point a lot. So poor financial literacy costs the UK economy £20 billion annually. That's a data point that comes from the CBI economics team that looked at what's happening when we have poor levels of financial literacy in our workforce and how it shows up. And actually the key factors that they looked at in calculating that cost to businesses was absences and sick leave and lower productivity, because people didn't feel like they could actually, effectively contribute to their workplace environment. And I think that's at its extreme end, but some of what you just mentioned there, I think is really, it's harder sometimes to spot in the system. And if I can maybe be a little bit controversial for a moment, because I think actually there are a lot of services and products in the market right now which present as a financial well-being solution for employers to consider. And one of those ways in which I see a lot of businesses sort of tackle the financial well-being problem that they see in their system is by signing up to programs which will allow people to access earned wages before they would otherwise normally. And I think what's really intriguing to me is, and I guess a call to action if anybody is using those types of tools, is to maybe just keep an eye on the data. What is the data and the behaviours telling you about people who may be regularly requiring access to earned wages? because I think we're not necessarily looking at those patterns of behaviours to spot whether there's something a bit more chronic going on underneath. So yeah, sorry, just wanted to add those couple of points.
No, really good. They're really, really good points. And I think that kind of takes us to I've hopefully Carla and I have covered quite clearly what the issues are. So I want to make sure that like you guys as attendees have got some ideas of what those initiatives that we can now put into place to try and kind of both approach the cause and effect of those behaviors, and it's kind of, if it's a full circle problem, then you also almost get a full circle solution when we start to address it. So obviously one of the first things was the financial education and talking about confidence and financial resilience. And as I say, Carla's actually come in and done that for us at Thrive herself, talking to us about that financial well-being, and talking a little bit about how we make financial well-being as a concept part of our mental health strategies. I think it's very easy for us to kind of think, well, our pay is our pay, our finances and the benefits are our finances and benefits, and not think about what that interlink looks like when we think about the mental health strategy piece that we might put together, and thinking about them as isolated issues. And hopefully what we've addressed here is that they're very much not isolated issues, and it should certainly be something that we are addressing when we're thinking about what is the mental health of our team. Are we gathering data on how mental health links to their financial well-being or financial literacy or confidence, or how supported they feel, and what is therefore the response to that. Salary transparency is actually something really interesting that Carla and I talked about quite a lot in preparation for this slide and for this session. And it was something we were talking about a lot in terms of, it's not going to work for everyone to be completely clear about what everyone earns and what kind of structure best suits. And for some people that's not suitable in their organisation, but there is scope to do something quite bespoke to your organisation, to still have that level of certainty and understanding that employees do feel that they want or need. Because quite often with finances, what we were talking about was actually is that uncertainty, or that inability to say to, for example, a mortgage broker, I'm earning this much at the moment, but I will be earning this much, and having that really kind of solidified and kind of really easy to articulate. So salary transparency doesn't have to be saying what everyone earns and what everyone's positions are, but perhaps giving individual ideas of, for things like pay bands, or giving individual ideas of what growth looks like, or what is, and having really clear and accessible and understandable policies on that. So not making it conditional on companies' EBITDAs or kind of really like complicated financial terms, and trying to make that really understandable from a individual perspective. And so that's something that we talked about quite a lot, isn't it, Carla?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of things to add to that. So again, if I look at the data that we've collected this year, talking to young people at the start of their career, we try to ask them, what's going on? Why do you have such high levels of financial stress in the system? And I suppose we came at this from the perspective of, is it just normal to be more stressed about managing your money when you're sort of in your early career, just because it's a very major transition time in your life? Maybe there's just a generalized level of anxiety and stress that comes with being at that stage of adulthood. And we really dug into the detail in the qualitative research that we did this year to ask, were there things happening in the workplace that were contributing to the level of financial stress? And actually, excuse me, this is one of the points that came up very loud and clear, that actually people felt it was quite hard for them to make meaningful plans about their financial future, because they didn't have access to information about what salary progression they could look forward to if they had a normal career trajectory in their organizations. They didn't know how much people were getting paid. They didn't know different types of salary bands were out there in their own organizations. So I think it's an interesting perspective to kind of reflect on. I think the other side of it for me is that, and folks on the call here may be aware of this already, that there is an EU pay transparency directive that's already been adopted within the EU. It's due to come in by 2026 within the European Union. And whilst, of course, the UK is no longer part of the European Union, I think it's a kind of interesting one, because it will require clarity on progression in roles, as well as transparency on pay prior to joining an organisation. So think about in job descriptions. And I do think employers who are part of multinational organisations should at least expect some of the attitudes and expectations that their European employee base have to cross borders, even if the legislation to adopt the same rules isn't going to cross borders. So I think that's just something to kind of bear in mind in terms of future regulatory changes, which may drive an expectation again in your workforce that they want to know more about this topic. And it's about, with all of these proactive initiatives, for me, one of the big things is just to say, I think a lot of firms are already doing a lot of good stuff in terms of crisis support. So when people really do have problems and they need help in the moment, I think firms do a really great job of making sure they have someone to call and speak to and go and get help. But I think, you know, more could be done in the preventative action space. And so when we're thinking about how we can stop crises happening in the first place, and we know the link between money and mental health challenges, I think there's a great call to action here to say, well, can we start to shore up resilience, confidence, and better financial management, but giving people the building blocks of greater financial literacy? And yeah, I think you've made that point here already, but it's really about thinking holistically when it comes to your mental health strategy.
Yeah, and also when we think about even that crisis support, but the things that companies already have in place, reminding people where they are and how you provide them and making it super accessible and understandable is something that's really important and comes through quite a lot. Having these kinds of annual, we brought the pension providers in to talk to you in a language that you don't really understand, that actually, if anything, just scares you because they tell you don't have enough money, isn't necessarily the most supportive way to structure it. What a better way maybe to have a really clear policy that explains it and gives them really helpful resources and explains external things that they can address. So just making sure that we have that through thread of, is it understandable and is it accessible? And if someone needed to know very urgently what our life insurance is, if that's something we provide, for example, have we written out, rather than just referring them to the existing terms of life insurance, which let's say are let's assume are very complicated, have we got like a simple breakdown of, if this happens, this is who you need to contact, this is how you do it? Because that's just something that feels quite obvious and is really a helpful support piece to put in place and kind of make that really easy.
Definitely.
And so then what are the kind of costs of inaction? And we've obviously talked a lot about kind of the financial impact on the economy and how it might impact when we do think about employers and not acting and not supporting employees' financial well-being. But generally, obviously, when we think about employees, especially with these pre-existing mental health conditions, what we sometimes see is that might result in irrational or erratic behaviour. And actually, Carla and I both came up with the same example, which is, for example, misuse of a company's expenses policy or misuse of a company credit card. And someone who is perhaps in crisis using that credit card without authorisation or for something they shouldn't be using it with. Now, obviously, under a company policy, that would be probably a disciplinary matter, probably would justify dismissal, subject to a few kind of points on how they respond to it. But what we need to bear in mind is if that is linked to a mental health condition that we are aware of, if we know that it is linked to perhaps even a neurodivergent condition, but if we know that arises from an existing condition, we need to bear in mind that we are risking that Section 15 unfavourable treatment claim if we don't consider what that cause was. Now, that's certainly not to say that that person couldn't be subject to an appropriate disciplinary. It's not the case that they're going to be able to be to kind of get off, quote unquote, scot-free. But what it means is that we need to be a lot more mindful of, instead of just going straight to sanction, what would a support look like? What communication might we want to surround this in terms of, was our policy clear enough? Were we mindful enough that giving someone access to this who has these issues is probably not the most appropriate thing that we could have done? And kind of just unpicking and not going straight to the harshest form of response and rallying that back, because that could be fit more within a legitimate aim of under a Section 15 defence, but also could be a reasonable adjustment if we say, you know, usually our policy warrants this response, and actually taking into account these factors, we've lessened that sanction. So it's just something really important to be aware of, is that actually where we think about in an extreme form, these financial concerns linked with mental health conditions could actually give rise to tribunal claims that could be very, very valid if not dealt with appropriately. So that's a very extreme version of it, but still something that we really want to have in our minds. So what we're going to do now is we're going to revisit that poll that we started with. So kind of back to where we were, but obviously the chat box, not the chat box, the Q&A is open as well. So if you do have any of those questions arising from anything that we've spoken about, or anything perhaps that you're doing that you wanted to share, anything like that, please do just pop that in the Q&A as well. Carla and I are here.
Yeah, and you should be able to access the Slido again through that Q&A that I dropped in earlier. It's still open, so please feel free to pop that in and then add any other questions you have for us. Great, I can see people are responding, so that's brilliant. Thank you. And I know we're in the last couple of minutes of the session today. So
yeah, thanks you so much for joining us, Carla. It's been so interesting to kind of have this discussion and just kind of, I think it's exactly as we were saying when we started prepping for it, just to kind of give the attention to that link for a little while, and just making sure that we give other people to just the opportunity to just think, actually, yeah, they're not isolated, and what does my mental health strategy look like, and have I considered this as quite a significant factor, actually. So over and above all your lovely, like, are we doing yoga and are we giving people fruit, are we also thinking about slightly more core day to day? And sometimes I think employers can think, well, your finances are your finances, not really my problem, but actually thinking about how we can intervene and support is really important.
100%. And I think the other thing, and maybe a last parting thought, is I know, because I've talked to a lot of businesses who, you know, say actually when they're thinking about budgets that are made available to support their people, a lot is made available on mental well-being, mental health and well-being. And then for some reason, we're still sort of carving out financial well-being as something separate, which might not be getting as much in terms of budgetary support from other leaders in the business. And I actually think there's a great opportunity to bring those two things together, thinking in the way we've done today, and actually making the case for supporting people's financial literacy to be part of your overarching mental health strategy. So yeah, listen, thank you so much to everybody who has joined us today. There's still time to ask a last question if you have any burning questions, but otherwise it's been great to chat, and I've learned loads going through this preparation for this session with the team from Thrive, so I hope you guys have taken something away as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. We will be announcing the details of our next session as well. So as we say, this is the three-parter, and the next session is really, it's going to be really interesting. So we're going to talk about kind of diversity and inclusion initiatives and financial well-being, and where, again, that kind of, the second you say it out loud, there's quite an obvious overlap, but it's not something that's necessarily addressed as consistently by employers as you might want it to, or as holistically, I suppose, is more the phrasing. So really excited for that session. So do kind of keep an eye on our socials, keep an eye on kind of however you found out about this one, you'll probably find out about the next one in the same way. So do keep an eye on that. And I really do hope it's been interesting and informative for you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Oh, that was cool. I liked that.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.